First, Mary Colwell looks at man's relationship with the largest rainforest on Earth and its future in Amazonia, keeping it alive.
For me, it's very pleasant to walk in the rainforest because it's very shadowed due to the close canopy, and there's a kind of freshness feeling. When you walk there, it's very wet, but it's comfortable.
It's an incredible place. It's a great unbroken sea of trees from the air and an unbroken canopy of green from below looking up, obviously teeming with animals and plants. And like most tropical rainforests, the afternoon often marked by a crashing thunderstorm, which actually is the most spectacular noise of all in some ways.
The Amazon, the greatest rainforest on Earth. Even after losing 20% to deforestation, it still covers 1.6 million square miles, and it contains a vast amount and diversity of life. It's one of the greatest expressions of life on Earth.
Around 30% of species that are found on the planet are found only in the Amazon rainforest. So 30% of all types of organisms that exist on planet Earth are found only in the Amazon rainforest.
50% of the forest is in Brazil. The rest is in Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Suriname and Guyana. It has its own rhythm and wildness that is outside of our human way of life. And it also changes in character from east to west. Yadvinder Mali is Professor of Ecosystem Science at the University of Oxford and heads up a team studying the relationship between the rainforest and the atmosphere.
We find that the western forests are very different because the soils are more fertile there. The forests grow faster, but they also die faster, so they're much more dynamic, and that feeds through into them supporting a much higher density of wildlife. It's much more nutritious forest in some ways, but also because of being more dynamic, perhaps they can be more responsive to changes such as climate change, because trees are relatively short-lived, they turn over quickly, whereas trees in the eastern part of the Brazilian Amazon live for hundreds of years and therefore can be slow in their response to ongoing climate change.
Climate change is one threat to the rainforest, but there are many others which we'll hear about later on. But this isn't a programme about the imminent demise of the greatest rainforest on Earth. This is an exploration of how we can keep it alive. I want to look at the relationship between ourselves and the animals and plants that make up this temple to diversity. But let's start at the beginning of our relationship with the Amazon. Tom Griffiths is an anthropologist working with the Forest Peoples Programme. I asked him how long have people lived in the Amazon.
Current consensus among archaeologists is at least 11 to 12,000 years before present. Emerging studies are pushing that back. Some recent work in Brazil has even suggested that occupation might go as far back as 30 or 40,000 years. Now, of course, that is not generally accepted yet in archaeological circles, but there are an increasing number of finds suggesting that occupation could be more than 11,000 years.
People, of course, have always been and always will be agents of change, even in small numbers 11,000 years ago. The history of our relationship with the Amazon is important because understanding the past informs what is happening today. Yadvinder Mali.
When we look back at what types of creatures existed in the Amazon 15,000 years ago before humans arrived, we see evidence of the lost elephants of the Amazon. These were creatures called gomphotheres that were very close cousins of elephants. Big hippo-like creatures called toxodons, completely unrelated to hippos, and there were other strange creatures like glyptodons, which were giant armadillos with spiky tails the size of a small car, wandering around in this region. And we estimate that around 70 of these large animal species went extinct around 10 to 12,000 years ago. And this is part of a pattern that we see around the world, which is known as the Pleistocene megafaunal extinctions, and that when humans went out of Africa and started colonizing the planet, whenever they arrived somewhere, very soon afterwards the large animals started going extinct.
People didn't stay as hunter-gatherers. Most went on to become farmers, and their numbers expanded. Tom Griffiths.
Current estimates are anything between 1 and even 4 million people living in the basin. Archaeologists have found, in fact, very fertile soils across the basin, something called Terra Preta do Indio, and it's called do Indio, of the Indian, because Amerindians actually formed these soils through their farming and gardening techniques. They're very fertile, and they're estimated to cover at least 11% of the basin. So that's a substantial area, to give you some idea.
An image of the rainforest teeming with farming communities, up to 4 million people, is strange today. There are nowhere near that number living in the Amazon at the moment. Yadvin Damali.
What happened to these people was that when Europeans first reached South America, they brought with them a number of old world diseases such as smallpox. And these diseases caused the populations on the Amazon to crash almost before Europeans really had major contact with these populations. And some estimates say that the population of the Amazon rainforest dropped by about 90% after first contact with Europeans.
We've always had a complicated interaction with the forest, changing the ecology both in terms of soil fertility and species. There's nothing new about people affecting the Amazon. But today our relationship is different. For the modern world, the Amazon is a source of resources needed by a global population, not just local farmers. What is contained in the Amazon is going outwards to Europe, North America and the growing Asian markets. And to get at these resources, the trees have to go. Deforestation started in earnest in the 1970s. From 1977 to 2005, on average, an area roughly the size of Wales, about 8,000 square miles, was felled each year. The wood was used for timber and cattle or crops were put on the cleared land. Since then, deforestation has fallen due to changes in commodity prices and actions by national governments. The 2011 figure is the lowest since 1977. But still over 2,000 square miles of forest were felled, mainly for beef production and for soybean plantations, which is used in animal feed and biodiesel. There are other causes of deforestation too. Tom Griffiths.
Much of the area is rich in minerals. Gold is one. Oil and gas also are key resources which companies working with national governments are extracting, and they're going into ever more remote areas. If we look at the Peruvian Amazon, as much as 70% of the Peruvian Amazon is under some form of negotiation or identified for sale for either timber, oil, gas or minerals. So that is a massive scale. And indeed, the indigenous peoples feel under siege. They feel under pressure from all sides. And that reminds me of one comment by a Shipibo leader in the Peruvian Amazon that said, "We feel we cannot breathe. We feel we're being choked. The government is slowly choking us." And why do they mention the government? Well, indeed, it is national governments which are issuing these commercial concessions to forest resources. This is an issue that's happening across the basin.
There's no doubt that global markets are significant drivers of deforestation, but it's easy to feel personally removed from these vast global financial transactions. So you might be surprised to know that the rate of deforestation of the Amazon can land firmly on our own doormat. Our own British farming activities have been implicated. Yadvin Damali.
One of the significant drivers for deforestation in the Amazon in the last few decades has been the acceleration of soybean production, produced at agro-industrial scales at the Amazon frontier. And one of the big surges in soybean production occurred in the early to mid-90s. And when we look into what caused this surge in demand for soybean protein, we can trace back one of the surges to, remarkably, the outbreak of BSE, mad cow disease, in the UK. After the outbreak of mad cow disease, farmers in Europe and governments in Europe realized it was a bad idea to feed dead cows to live cows and needed an alternative source of protein, and looked to one of the cheapest supplies of protein worldwide, which is soybean from Brazil. And that caused a rise in the demand for soybean, and that in turn made it more profitable to clear areas of the rainforest and plant soybean farms there.
Of course, the loss of trees is the loss of animals and plants that depend on the forest for survival, but it also drives the loss of the indigenous communities. If we're serious about holding on to all of life in the Amazon, human and non-human, then supporting the indigenous population has to be a priority. Monitoring of satellite imagery by the Woods Hole Research Center in the US and the Environmental Research Institute in the Amazon show that if the Amerindian communities can live in the forest, they protect it. Tom Griffiths.
There is indeed a scientific proof, and growing amount of proof in fact, that where Indigenous peoples' land rights are secure, where they are recognised in practice, not just on paper, yes indeed, forests are healthy and intact in those areas. In fact, they're 10 times less likely to be deforested than areas outside of Indigenous territories. And from satellite imagery and aerial photography, we can see there's a clear correlation between these demarcated and protected Indigenous territories and healthy, intact forest ecosystems.
I thought that there were quite a lot of laws actually in place to protect the rights of the Indigenous people and indeed to protect the forest itself.
Well, that's a very good point. It's true that in recent decades, a number of Amazonian countries have adopted progressive legislation. The problem is they're not being implemented. So there's some good laws on the books, but I'm afraid they're not being implemented on the ground.
Philip Burnside is an ecologist who's lived and worked in the Brazilian Amazon for more than 30 years and is now a Brazilian citizen. He's a research professor at the National Institute for Research in the Amazon in Manaus, the city in the heart of the rainforest. His work looks at how the forest can be used sustainably in an increasingly complicated and demanding world. I spoke to him in his office in Manaus and asked if the laws already in place were sufficient to protect the rainforest and its people.
No, there are certainly many laws that need to be strengthened, and Brazil is at a critical point now because there is a very strong lobby of what are called ruralistas. These are representatives of the large landowners in the National Congress who are gutting the environmental legislation. And right now the Forestry Code is in this process, and there are several other laws that are also on the chopping block.
The Forest Code of Brazil, which Philip mentions, was hailed as a landmark in forest legislation when it was introduced in 1965. It required landowners to preserve 80% of their forest as legal reserves. Right now, the Forest Code is being weakened by a legal overhaul. Critics say the new Forest Code will, in effect, make it easier for landowners to clear forest, which would equal the size of the UK and France combined. These areas have, up till now, been considered out of bounds, and Philip Burnside believes it will have a serious effect on wildlife.
This is really a disastrous change because it removes a lot of the protection along the riversides, on steep hillsides, and on hilltops. And these are the areas that are most critical for biodiversity and also for the hydrological functions, protecting from flooding and so forth. This is exactly the part of the forest that should be protected most, and a lot of the protection is being removed.
I put these criticisms to Roberto Cavalcanti, the National Secretary of Forests and Biodiversity in the Brazilian national government. Why has the government decided to weaken the Forest Code?
Most rural properties in Brazil are out of compliance with this code. So although the code establishes extremely high levels of environmental protection, in practice you have enormous variance and tremendous non-compliance.
You can understand, though, the concern people have when the level of protection is being reduced on top of giving an amnesty to those who've already broken the law and deforested greatly. Everyone is saying this is just moving entirely in the wrong direction to protect the biodiversity of the Amazon.
Well, the protection required for the Amazon, as you're well aware, is at 80%. The question is, how do you arrange that? And then what it sets is then minimum distances in which you can deforest up to the edge of the river. But the level of percent is being maintained for forest properties in the Brazilian Amazon, yes.
It's not just the legal wrangling that may cause problems for the Amazon. Big plans for developing the infrastructure throughout the basin, like dams and roads, are causing serious concern. Philip Burnside.
There are tremendous plans for building highways and dams in the Amazon, including the highway from Rondônia, which is the most famous place in the Amazon for deforestation, to Manaus in the center of the Amazon. And that links up with a road network that's already in place and opens up basically about half of what's left of the Amazon forest. You also have the 10-year plan for the expansion of energy from 2011 to 2020 that was announced last year. And that calls for 30 large dams by 2020. So 30 dams in 10 years is 3 dams every year, or 1 dam every 4 months. Of course, each one has to have a highway built to it and deforestation and so forth, in addition to the tremendous impacts on the rivers and the people who live there.
Once the dam has been built, large areas of low-lying forest are flooded behind the dam wall, and the higher ground is left literally high and dry, as islands in a vast lake. Karini Emer is a biologist who studied these fragmented areas. I asked her what they're like.
For example, in Baubina Dam, that is the largest and catastrophic dam already built in Amazon, the lake can reach 200 kilometers in extension and 70 kilometers wide. So it means that in Baubina, for example, this fragmentation created more than 3,500 islands, and the lower areas are flooded.
Tell me what happens to the islands that remain.
Well, the islands, they become a very different environment than undisturbed forest. It means that all the process of regenerating and the growing is different than undisturbed forest. For example, you have the high trees that are characteristic of the tropical forest. They rapidly die or get broken due to the strongest winds that happen there.
Yeah, there's less protection for them, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. And then instead of have the normal process of regeneration, you just have the pioneer trees growing and dominated the understory.
And are the animals and plants different? Does it sound different?
Yeah, I think so. When you go visually, you can see that the structure of the forest change a lot. And for example, my study there with interactions between ant and plants, you see that when you go to fragments, you lost lots of species that need the condition of the forest to survive.
Brazil has a commitment to provide green energy, and dams are a major part of the plans of the future. But are the environmental costs acceptable? I put these concerns to Roberto Cavalcanti.
Right now, what's being done is saying, look, can we make smaller lakes? And several recent ones have been reduced in size due to environmental concerns. What do we do about the 30, 100,000 people that will move into a region? The only answer you can give that's credible is that saying you have to have in place, in addition to infrastructure development, you have to have social development plans and a network of reserves and conservation areas that will ensure that a certain level of biodiversity and of ecosystem services and of forest cover are maintained.
Is this the same plan that is going to be put in place then for the large roads that are planned to be built?
You have a number of choices, and none of them are easy choices, because if you do nothing, illegal logging is going to happen regardless because of the value of the wood. Just one tree of mahogany can cost tens of thousands of dollars, can go up as high as $100,000. So I mean, with that incentive, road or no road, people will find a way to extract that stuff.
Money talks many different languages, and it doesn't only talk, often it shouts above everything else. So maybe an economic approach to saving the rainforest is an effective one. Tony Juniper, former director of Friends of the Earth, was asked by Prince Charles in 2008 to help him establish the Prince's Rainforest Project.
The thing at the time was really around the carbon agenda and the extent to which countries might be able to agree some way whereby standing forests could be kept standing through some compensation mechanism linked to the amount of carbon they held.
And just give me some of those ways. I mean, there's the thing called the Rainforest Bond, isn't there?
We looked at various mechanisms that effectively would be a way of transferring money to countries that had forest and were planning to keep their forest. And I guess the one that did come to fruition in a way which is perhaps indicative of the concept more than anything else that's going on right now is the deal that was done in that period between the president of Guyana and the Prime Minister of Norway. These two countries coming together, one with money, i.e. the Norwegians from their domestic oil and gas industry in particular, and the Guyana citizens with a large area of rainforest looking to develop, looking to improve the living standards of their citizens, but not wishing to cut down their forest. And so they were in the market for a conversation with the Norwegians, which led to an agreement which is now in train, whereby the Norwegian government is paying the government of Guyana not to cut its rainforests down. And they've calculated the amount of money that should be transferred on the basis of how much carbon is being kept in the trees rather than being released into the atmosphere.
The United Nations RED programme, Reducing Emissions Through Deforestation and Degradation, is a similar initiative. This is something Philip Burnside welcomes as part of the mix of plans that may help keep the Amazon alive.
In the case of climate change, you have something that does have a significant financial value. It is enough to make a real difference in terms of maintaining significant areas of Amazon forest. And it's important that the negotiations on that advance, because it is a valid way to fight climate change, and it's also a valid way to maintain the forest.
Yadvinder Mali and Tony Juniper agree, but also highlight the dangers of making the Amazon purely a source of money.
There's a psychological and emotional danger if we start seeing every aspect of our planet as part of a commodity on some international market. We risk devaluing much of what is precious about nature. So I think we always do need to realize that this is a useful tool rather than a new worldview that we are trying to create.
But what I would say is that given the world we live in, one of the tools that we can now effectively use under some circumstances are economic ones, and that we should be using these in ways that enable us to do the conservation objectives in the short term, whilst recognising the long-term intrinsic values of nature, which go well beyond the immediate economic price we can put on nature.
Using power and profit have their advantages when it comes to preserving life on Earth. But there is another approach which some feel is the most important, a sense of moral, even religious responsibility for the earth. Some of those who've acted on these compulsions have paid the ultimate price. In 1988, Chico Mendes, a rubber trapper who campaigned for sustainable use of the forest, was assassinated by a ranch owner. In 2005, Sister Dorothy Stang, a Catholic nun aged 74, was shot dead for her high-profile work protecting the poor and the forest. In May 2011, Jose da Silva and his wife Maria were shot in a nature reserve by loggers for their gentle but determined activism. And just days later, Dino Ramos, another activist who campaigned for the rights of poor farmers and for forest protection, was shot dead in front of his wife and young children. There are many, many more examples, including indigenous Indians from many different communities, and often it seems justice is slow to be done. This is no soft spirituality. All the victims are environmentalists who believed what Dorothy Stang wore on a t-shirt. The death of the rainforest is the death of us all. So how important is this moral action in keeping the Amazon alive? Brazil is the largest Catholic country on earth. Catholics make up 2/3 of the population. The Church works with the poor and the marginalised and set up the Pastoral Land Commission to help support the poor farmers moving into the Amazon region. Bishop Macier is the Vice President of the Brazilian Catholic Bishops' Conference Amazon Committee. I asked him what the Church is doing to protect not only the people, but the rainforest itself.
Levam para lá, beneficiam e ainda sai ganhando. Então,
the cause of the Amazon is not just Catholic, but for all the churches in Brazil. And the Lutherans have a very clear position and do a lot of good work. The Catholic Bishops' Conference is clear about its respect for the conservation of the Amazon. There is a dialogue between us and the government about the new forest code and how it could destroy the forest. I've been a bishop for over 40 years, and I have seen what has happened to the Amazon. When I was a bishop in Porto Velho, in a small town called Nova California, we helped 200 to 300 families to get 2 hectares each and produce fruits and nuts. They make a good living without destroying the forest, and have been doing so for 25 years. They don't need to remove the forest. It isn't necessary to take vast amounts of land as the cattle farmers do.
Although Amazonian Indians have used the forest for thousands of years, they do so with a different mindset to many large companies. Tom Griffiths believes the spiritual beliefs of the Indian communities is a strong driver behind their actions for protecting the Amazon.
Their attitude to the resources, first of all, is that they're not lifeless and innate resources to be used. They actually consider that many of the forest resources, including trees, are occupied by guardian spirits, and there is a reverence for these and indeed a respect for them, partly based on fear. If the resources are used in a careless or disrespectful way, this can bring misfortune and sickness on the community. So there are strong beliefs, including religious beliefs, that hold that the forest should be used sensibly and that you should only take what you need. And there's a strong repugnance for waste. That is something that is condemned in many, many of these cultures.
Politics, economics, religion. They're all playing their part in determining the future of the greatest rainforest on Earth. How these different approaches can work together to ensure the Amazon's survival in the future is not certain. And as in many human activities, perhaps there is no plan to follow, just a chaotic feeling of the way forward. But protect it we must, not as a precious object that has to be wrapped in cotton wool, but as a lively, dynamic, bountiful area of the earth that has a value in its own right, as well as being a source of essential services needed by the whole world. Yadvinder Mali.
I think many of us in the West have this view of the Amazon rainforest as this huge conservation park. It holds wonderful levels of biodiversity, and we want to see that biodiversity prosper and continue. Others have other views. Farmers or ministries in the Amazon countries may see this as a huge amount of agricultural land that can power their economies and be the breadbasket of an ever-hungry world where we need to feed 9 billion people. Others can see it as a source of timber for global timber demand and the need to power the growing economies of Asia and South America and other regions. Others can see it for the value of the rainfall and the climate. So there are many different ways of viewing how we see the future of the Amazon rainforest. And so in the end, perhaps view the Amazon less as this pristine wilderness, which to some extent perhaps it never has been a pristine wilderness, and to see it more as this garden, this mixture of different land uses and different ways of managing the forest. And this is a new concept, but in some ways this is a view I think that the indigenous peoples of the Amazon have had for thousands of years, that it isn't some park to be cut off from the hand of humanity, but it's some part of this living world that we live in that influences us and is our home, but we also have an influence on.
Amazonia, Keeping It Alive was produced and presented by Mary Colwell for the BBC Natural History Unit in Bristol.